Hello, welcome back, and welcome to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it is on our shelves, it is history. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I will be the administrator for today's event, like I said, which we call A House Divided. In a minute, I will introduce you to your host and to your author, but first, just a little bit of housekeeping. The book that we are featuring today is The Last Lincoln Republican by Benjamin Todd Arrington, and you will meet Todd Arrington in just a moment. I want you to know that while we are live on Facebook, you know we're on Facebook. Well, while we're streaming live to Facebook, you can ask questions by putting questions in the comments section of this Facebook feed. Please do that. We really want to share your questions with the author and find out what you want to know about the 1880 presidential election between James Garfield and Winfield Scott Hancock. Also, during the course of this program, we will put a link to the order page at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop website, where you can click right on through and order a first edition copy of The Last Lincoln Republican, signed by Todd Arrington on this custom Abraham Lincoln Bookshop book plate. Thank you, Todd, for doing that for us so that our customers can have a signed book. I think that is all the housekeeping we have for today. So let me introduce you to your host for A House Divided, Daniel Weinberg of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Welcome, everyone. Appreciate your being with us either live or if you're on YouTube at this point. Either way, we thank you for being here. And if you are seeing this afterward, by the way, we'll most likely still have books, signed books ready for you. So always ask if you're seeing this later and have an interest and get the itch to get this fine little book. Benjamin Todd Arrington, we're so happy to have you here, site manager of James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Mentor, Ohio, the author of Medal of Honor at Gettysburg, and numerous essays on the Civil War and on Reconstruction. So this is his most recent book, The Last Lincoln Republican Presidential Election of 1880, University of Kansas Press, 220 pages illustrated, and it's $39.95 and worth every penny. Now, the book is part of a series. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Todd likes to be called Todd, by the way, his middle name, and we, of course, Mary Todd, etc. We're going to use it as well. So it is part of a series, yes?
Yes, it is. Yeah, the University Press of Kansas does a presidential election series.
Before we get into the book, please tell us a bit about the Garfield National Historical Site. I've been there back in the 80s, and you told me post-show, pre-show that it's changed.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here, and thank you for having me. And yes, we are a unit of the National Park Service. So the same folks you see at places like Gettysburg or Yosemite or the Grand Canyon, that's us too. And we have about 8 acres. It's the home and some of the very small sliver of the original 160-acre property that belonged to James A. Garfield. And it's the site from which he campaigned for the presidency in 1880.
So why were you drawn to this story right now? Maybe University of Kansas came to you and said, this is what we want to do next. Is that why you were drawn, or you had already begun this? Why resurrect Garfield's story now?
Well, it's a great question. And there's a lot of reasons. Of course, I live and breathe this every day at work, going to Garfield's home to work every day for the last almost 12 years. So there's that aspect of it. And I am a historian by training and education, and a historian of 19th century American politics, in fact. So obviously being at this site for the last 12 years has been right in my wheelhouse. I really wasn't necessarily planning to write this book. The University Press of Kansas does this elections series. They did not have a volume on 1880. They initially went to a friend and something of a mentor of mine, a historian named Heather Cox Richardson, who most people have, perhaps a lot of people here have heard of. She's very well known in the historical community and beyond. And they asked her if she would be interested in writing the book, and she said no, but I think I know somebody who would. And so then at that point, the University Press of Kansas came to me. So it was a kind of a combination of things.
Now, I just want to quickly get into your sources, kind of briefly, but what were the major sources? I know that there's a Garfield diary, and it must have been important to your research. Was it written, though, for historians to see later? Was he writing for his legacy? What's his tone and reliability?
Yeah, so Garfield's diary has been published, so it is a published primary source. They were published by the Michigan State University Press back in the early 1980s, I believe. And they go from, really fairly early in his life to his maybe say late teens, early 20s, really all the way up. Literally the last diary entry he makes is the day before he's shot as president of the United States. It's very detailed, very rich. It's a great way to learn about him, about his family, about a lot of the major political players at that point. I mean, the people that you see and hear things about in this diary are just, including Abraham Lincoln and many others. I think for the most part, it is a very honest diary because frankly, there are some things in there that maybe you question a little bit, like, wow, did he really think that? There's some language in there that is probably makes people today sort of, kind of clutch their pearls a little bit sometimes. So yeah, I do think for the most part, it was a fairly honest diary. That was a major source. And then there are other volumes of his letters and major speeches and things like that were of great use to me as well.
I was going to get to this later, but now that I'm at this, behind me, I have, of course, Grant's memoirs, but they're not really a part of this book. But I do have James Blaine, his 2 volumes, and John Sherman. Actually, now that I'm doing this, I'll take it out. This is the limited edition.
Oh, wow. Beautiful.
And it's just gorgeous because it was John Sherman, William Tecumseh's brother, right?
Yep.
And in fact, this is a limited. Let me see if I can do this without breaking it. Signed by him.
Oh, beautiful. Wow.
So again, briefly, how about the memoirs of Sherman and of Blaine? How important were those to you? And were those reliable or again, looking to their legacy?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I mean, Blaine and Sherman obviously are 2 hugely important people in Garfield's orbit and in his life, and certainly in his quest for the presidency in 1880. So yeah, I did not spend nearly as much time in those, obviously, as I did in the Garfield diaries. But yes, I did look at those and found them to be very useful as well. I'm not so sure about Blaine. I'm not an expert on either one of those guys, obviously, but I'm not so sure about Blaine and kind of how honest and how honest he was or how much he was looking to the future. Sherman certainly seemed pretty straightforward to me. And again, even regarding the 1880 election, because of course, and maybe we'll get into this, there's a great Garfield-Sherman connection for sure in that 1880 election. And Sherman did say some things in his memoirs about that election and about his feelings about not getting the nomination and Garfield getting it. That seemed pretty honest to me.
Now, another book that I just picked out of my own library, I've had this for a while, are the Garfield Hinsdale letters that went back and forth. Beautiful jacket, actually, for this. That's why I have it. I think I love jackets. Was this a good source for you for the political end?
Oh, absolutely, because Garfield and Hinsdale were very close for many years.
Who was
and that
Hinsdale?
Hinsdale was Garfield's successor as the what they called at the time principal of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, which today is Hiram College. It's a small liberal arts college here in Northeast Ohio. But Hinsdale and Garfield were very good friends. And yeah, Garfield and Hinsdale exchanged letters for years. So yeah, those were also very valuable. And they were actually edited by Hinsdale's daughter. So also very good and very reliable sources.
Where are the originals?
They are, I would guess, maybe in the archives at Hiram College would be my guess. I just used published volumes because I knew what I was looking for and that it was in there. So, but I would guess they're probably there.
Well, we're going to get into the weeds on this, but I'd like to get a broader sense of why you call Garfield the last true Lincoln Republican. Garfield certainly echoed Lincoln. For instance, he said of the Emancipation, liberated the master as well as the slave from a wrong that enfeebled both. That certainly comes from Lincoln as well. So how is he a continuation of Lincoln or his policy, or you tell me?
Sure. Well, one of my coworkers made an observation about the book that I hadn't thought of, but I think she had a good point, which was that I just put Lincoln in the title because that way it would sell, which I honestly didn't do, but it was a good observation, and I appreciated that. But I do feel that the title is appropriate because what I'm arguing here is simply that Garfield was the last of that kind of first generation of Republicans that ended up becoming president, who really did view the national federal government and the Republican Party as vehicles to promote equality. And of course, in the early days of the Republican Party, that equality was sometimes racial, almost always economic in nature. It obviously sort of went more towards a view on racial equality as time progressed, for obvious reasons, Civil War and Reconstruction and Emancipation Proclamation. But what I'm arguing is that by the time Garfield was running for president in 1880 and then became president, a lot of Republicans, even former so-called radical Republicans, had kind of started to move away from this idea that the government had a role to play in civil rights for the formerly enslaved people. And Garfield's one of the few Republicans at that time, at least with a national profile, who is still very adamant that the government and the Republican Party still have a very important role to play. Our work is not done. And in fact, the quote that you read at the beginning of the question comes from Garfield's inaugural address. So even as far forward as 1881, when a lot of Republicans have moved away from civil rights, and this is kind of the period when they're starting to become sort of the party of big business, if you will. They're becoming more allied with financiers and industrialists. Garfield is one of the Republicans that's still saying, hey, we have a lot of work to do here on guaranteeing not only the physical safety, but the civil and political rights of the formerly enslaved in the South.
Well, I was going to get to this a long time later, but now that we've brought this up, I want to talk about vice presidents for a moment. They seem to be important choices because almost 20% of our presidents have not made it through their term. So the vice presidents become fairly important. Now with Kennedy, LBJ carried on, strangely enough, his policies on civil rights. But Lincoln didn't have that after him with Johnson.
Definitely.
And I guess Garfield didn't have that with Arthur. So looking back, is that a lost opportunity to have continued on this role from Lincoln through Garfield? He didn't know he was going to be assassinated, but maybe they should have chosen someone who was more like him.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, Garfield didn't really choose Arthur.
No.
This is the era when conventions, parties and conventions were absolutely critical. I mean, today, conventions, there's a lot of pageantry and they're fun to watch on TV sometimes, but ultimately the convention is really just kind of rubber stamping what the voters have chosen through the primary system. but that didn't exist at this time. So Garfield really had little say in who the vice presidential nominee would be. In fact, Garfield was hoping that they would choose Levi Morton, who was also a New Yorker. New York, of course, was a hugely important state, and it was the critical state in this election, and everybody knew it would be the critical state in this election. So everybody assumed that a New Yorker would be the vice presidential candidate. Garfield preferred Morton. Arthur was really put in there as kind of a little bit of a tip of the cap to the other faction of the party. Right. This is the era of stalwarts and half-breeds. Garfield is considered more of a half-breed.
Would Morton have carried on his policies?
I don't think so. I don't frankly think Morton was much better than Arthur, at least in terms of what he would have brought to the table for Garfield. And in fact, Garfield ended up in this kind of major dispute with Roscoe Conkling, who was, the king of the patronage system in New York. He ended up in this major dispute with Conkling about civil service reform, and specifically the collector of the Port of New York. And one of the reasons for that dispute was the stalwart faction led by Conkling feeling like Garfield had kind of promised them that Morton would be named Secretary of the Treasury. He's a New Yorker, he's a Wall Street guy. And then Garfield did not make that selection. And Garfield, of course, swore up and down he didn't make that promise. But anyway, going back to the original question about Arthur, Garfield did have this great vision for civil rights, and he was serious about civil rights and dedicated to it. But he's president so briefly that he didn't really have time to do much about civil rights and civil service. Or anything else. So civil service reform really became the major issue of Garfield's very brief presidency. To his credit, Arthur, who owed his entire career to patronage and to Roscoe Conkling, did carry Garfield's feelings about civil service reform forward, did sign the Pendleton Act to reform the civil service in early 1883. So you can say it's sort of how Johnson, picked up the mantle of the civil rights bill after Kennedy's death. Arthur did the same with the civil rights, with the civil service reform bill, the Pendleton Act in 1883.
That's a very good point to remember about Arthur, that at least he did carry on some of the administration that he was brought into. Let's go back a little bit to a broader question. It was the Gilded Age, and it was known as an era of congressional ascendancy. But give us a broad overview. Should we be giving this a more nuanced look at this time as far as the role of presidents in this era concerned? What about Garfield, Hayes, Arthur, Cleveland? Did they try to have any power over Congress, or really Congress was it?
Well, that's a great question. And there's been this sort of view in even among historians until, fairly recently, that, the presidency is just kind of filled with a bunch of really unimportant nobodies from really the death of Lincoln up until the time of the era of Theodore Roosevelt. So you get all of these, post-Civil War bearded Republicans, and, people can't remember which one is which. I obviously reject that notion completely. I think presidents are all, good presidents and bad presidents are always hugely important and hugely influential. So I do think it's a bit of a misnomer to talk about congressional ascendancy. I think we're seeing now, Grant has been completely reassessed and was much stronger, especially on civil rights, than people have given him credit for. Hayes did make an attempt to reform civil service. He kind of started that path that Garfield ended up continuing down. And even Arthur, I think, frankly, is a little bit underappreciated, and especially for being willing to kind of distance himself from the Grants and the Conklings of the world, who
and
just
his own past.
Yeah, exactly. His own, the people that he owed his entire life and career to. So I think Arthur is underappreciated as well. So yes, Congress is obviously very strong, very influential at this point. But I do think I think the whole idea that presidents just didn't matter at this point is very much overblown.
Was Hayes, Hayes went into the presidency saying he was going to be one term, am I right? So
Correct.
did he come in really as a lame duck, that he wouldn't have much power because everyone knew he wasn't going to be there?
Well, it's interesting, certainly, to consider what that did to the Republican Party, because the Republican Party knew as early as the summer of 1876, months before the election, that Hayes would only serve one term if he won. So, yeah, I mean, I guess in a way, you could argue that he kind of came in as a lame duck. Hayes, of course, then comes in with even more baggage, if you will, because of the disputed election where he, lost the popular vote to Tilden, and they had to create this electoral commission, and the commission eventually decides that Hayes, not Tilden, will become president because of the electoral votes of those southern states. And Garfield, of course, was a member of that commission in 1877.
Well, you say that to understand the 1880 election, which is what this book is about, you say that it's critical to make sense of that election by delving into the 1876 election, which we've heard a bunch of in many op-eds recently.
Oh,
That
yes.
1876 election has been all over the place.
Yeah.
Very briefly, elevator talk.
Sure.
What was it that makes it critical to the 1880 election?
Well, first of all, the idea that I just mentioned, that the Republicans needed a candidate in 1880, they would not have a president running for a second term. But also, how did the result of that 1876 election really affect Reconstruction? I mean, Hayes, people kind of popularly say that, oh, Hayes is the guy that sort of sold out the African-American population in the South and ended Reconstruction. I think that's overblown too, because there was a lot of that was ending already. I mean, there were only really 3 Southern states still being run by carpetbagging Republicans by the time that the 1876 election. So I think the 1876 sets the stage for 1880 in a number of ways. Who are the Republicans going to run in 1880, but also what kind of climate and environment is that person going to be running in? Are they still going to be able, for example, to garner a lot of African American support? I mean, African Americans are Republicans at this point, but do they feel sold out by this supposed deal that made Hayes president? So I think it just kind of sets the stage very well for 1880, and that's why I started the book actually with kind of a synopsis of what happened in 1876.
Well, of course, this was a time of parties in transition, and each was trying to get away a bit from its past and remold itself to its present. What was each trying to do?
Well, the Republicans, as I said already, were starting to kind of think that, okay, we've won the Civil War, we've put through the Emancipation Proclamation, and we've passed and put into place 3 constitutional amendments that deal with abolishing slavery and granting citizenship and granting suffrage. So a lot of Republicans by 1880 are kind of thinking, okay, we've done enough. This is the only issue we've been focused on for the last 15 or 20 years. It's time to find other issues to worry about and that are going to allow us to stay in power. The Democrats, of course, are still very much dedicated to this, because again, this is the time when the Republicans are kind of still primarily the progressives, and the Democrats are still primarily at this point the conservatives. And the Democrats, especially in the South, are very, very eager to reestablish white supremacy to as much as they possibly can in the South. And that's why this 1880 election, in fact, is the first instance of the solid South. In this case, it's a solid Democratic South. All voting for Winfield Scott Hancock in 1880 because he's the Democratic candidate, and there's some of his personal history that led them to think that he would be an ally to their desires to push African Americans to the side as much as possible and really reestablish dominance over them socially and politically. So yeah, both parties are changing a little bit. Obviously, my interest is in primarily in the Republicans because that's the party that Garfield was in, and also just how was Garfield not quite ready to let the Republican Party move away from issues that he still thought were really important, primarily revolving around civil rights.
You already you mentioned, I should say, the stalwart Republicans. briefly, who were they and who were the triumvirates that I've already shown maybe some of them behind me, but who were they and what was their moment at this time? And I think the stalwarts were what, against civil service reform?
Right. So
And
yeah,
for Grant as a third term as well.
correct. Yeah. So the Republican Party is kind of split into two factions at this point. The stalwarts, and really the primary difference between the two is civil service reform, and then in the summer of 1880, the idea of whether or not Grant should run again. Stalwarts are opposed to civil service reform. They like the patronage system, the spoils system, where if to the victors go the spoils, and if you win an election, you can appoint whoever you want to thousands of different positions potentially. That helped them build bases of power. That's how guys like Roscoe Conkling became powerful. He had so many people that owed him everything because he had gotten them a job or an ambassadorship or whatever. The half-breed Republicans, which is obviously kind of a derisive name, really aren't that much different than the stalwarts, except many of them do favor some degree of civil service reform, making civil service not beholden to office holders who can just assign jobs to whoever they want, but making it more of a merit-based system. You have to pass an exam, you have to be qualified, and your loyalty is not to the person who got you your job. It's to the Constitution. It's to good civil service. The triumvirate that you mentioned is basically the leaders of the stalwart faction. Roscoe Conkling, senator from New York, John Logan, senator from Illinois, and Don Cameron, who was a senator from Pennsylvania. And those three guys really were driving the train that was trying to force a third term nomination for Ulysses S. Grant at the 1880 Republican Convention in Chicago.
Oh, Grant certainly would have liked it. And of course, he went out right after his administration, went on a huge world tour, reporters following him and writing on him. And as you mentioned, maybe in the book, that he came back a little bit too early, maybe for his presidential bid. But certainly he was looking forward to it again. And certainly Julia, his wife, wanted it. She was pretty bitter having to leave Washington and not go for a third term. You quote in the book George W. Bush in a footnote saying that the presidency and its power is addictive. And I think that's what Julia and Ulysses had found. And even though the time was that you didn't go forth and say, hey, I want to be president, but you made yourself known.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question Grant was, very careful, following the custom of the time, didn't publicly say, yes, nominate me for a third term. I'd love to be president again. But yes, he certainly was interested and was, as he said, if the country called for him, he would do his duty. The whole idea of third terms at this point is controversial, not because of a constitutional amendment, which didn't exist at that time, which does exist now, that says you can't serve more than 2 full terms. But that was the example that had been set by George Washington, who had, after 2 terms as the first president, had voluntarily walked away, had turned the presidency over to his successor, John Adams. I mean, we've certainly heard a lot about a peaceful transition of power in the last 2 months and really in the last week or 10 days, especially. But yes, there's no question Grant was interested in being the nominee again. And as you mentioned, Mrs. Grant was probably even more interested in it than he was. But yeah, no doubt.
Another big issue of the day is one that we've had in our day, and that's immigration. And, it's always the newest crowd in is the one that those who are here already aren't as happy to see come in. Started with the Irish, the Germans. I mean, now we feel they're American citizens even, but not back then, maybe before this. But now it was the Chinese that were wanting to come in, and that was a large issue, was it not?
Oh, absolutely. That was a big issue even before the 1880 election. And in fact, I think I quote in the book at one point when Garfield was still in the House of Representatives, he's very critical of James Blaine supporting an anti-Chinese bill that's coming before Congress. And Garfield basically notes in his diary that he thinks Blaine is doing this just because Blaine thinks that will help make him president.
Mhm.
And so, yes, this was a big issue. And especially during the 1880 campaign, there was a little bit of a dirty trick played on Garfield where someone forged this letter that was supposed to be written in Garfield's hand, which indicated that he favored unlimited Chinese immigration, which he didn't. I mean, Garfield didn't have a lot to say about Chinese immigration in his diary or his letters. He did, sort of have unkind things to say about Blaine supporting that bill in the late 1870s. But Garfield had an eye, obviously, on winning an election, a presidential election in 1880, and he was very interested, obviously, in winning the votes of those states on the West Coast, particularly California. And so he was trying to sort of, play, straddle the fence, I guess you would say, and not just say very much about Chinese immigration. And then, of course, in a sort of another irony here, Garfield, of course, dies, and then Arthur becomes president. And Arthur is the president who does end up signing the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Mm. Well, this book mainly is about Garfield, of course. And could you just give us a quick overview of his character? Was he religious? What formed him? Strengths, weaknesses? He was certainly courageous in battle.
Yes, Garfield is born here in Northeast Ohio, where I'm sitting right now. I think one of the earliest things that happened to him that really formed who he was his father died when Garfield was only about 18 months old. So he really grew up, fatherless because of his dad's early death. Grew up in great poverty. That also shaped him. Obviously he and his siblings were all very close to their mother. Because she was their only parent. And his mother, exerted a very strong influence on him. She's the one that really convinced him to go to school, to get an education, and to try the life of a scholar. And it turns out Garfield really had a knack for that. So education was something that was hugely important to him, not only as an individual, but as a representative in Congress too. In fact, Garfield was the first congressman to suggest there needed to be a federal Bureau of Education because he thought it was so important. So education was critical to forming his character. The service in the Civil War clearly was important to him, as it was for millions of men and women of that era. And Garfield never really called himself an abolitionist, but I think that's certainly the title that we, reading what he had to say and the speeches he gave, I think that's the title that we could put to him. So he grew up in an area here in Northeast Ohio that was very much anti-slavery, and that really formed him as well as going up to college in Massachusetts and getting into what he called that abolitionist atmosphere.
Before we leave this and go to Bjorn, he may have someone on the line for us. I just wanted to finish this up because he was fairly self-taught militarily. In the Civil War, he read Napoleonic tactics and other things, and became self-taught. So did Lincoln, for that matter, for himself. But then he turned into a congressman in the middle of it. What were his priorities as a congressman during the Civil War?
Well, it's interesting you say that because he was elected to Congress in the fall of 1862. He's still with the Army, still in the field, and at this point doesn't really have to report to become a congressman until December of 1863. So he's got over a year to stay in the Army, which he does. And at one point goes to Washington and actually gets an audience with Lincoln and explains to Lincoln that he's torn. He of course, really wants to go to Congress because he sees himself having a future in politics. But he also feels obligated to stay with the Army. And he tells Lincoln this. And Lincoln, of course, convinces him to go to Congress. You know that he had more generals than he knew what to do with, and of course that's well established how Lincoln felt about some of his generals. But Lincoln did not feel he had enough reliable Republican votes in the House, and also votes from congressmen who had been in the Army and knew what the Army needed. So Garfield's priorities when he got to Congress and the war was still going on were simply to give the Army as much support as it could, to give Lincoln as much support as he could, to make the war about slavery, which of course by the time he actually got there, Lincoln had done. But Garfield expressed frankly, some disaffection with Lincoln because he felt like Lincoln waited too long to do that. And then, of course, to determine how were former Confederates going to be treated after the war ended.
I have a question to come into that to follow up after Bjorn pops up here, please.
Hey, sure. Thank you very much. I want to, first of all, I just want to send a shout out to some of the folks who are watching. We have a lot of people watching on Facebook Live, and we thank you for jumping onto our Facebook account and watching this live interview from Facebook. It is better than watching it on YouTube later, because if you ask a question later on YouTube, nobody is going to be there immediately to answer it for you. And the person that would answer it would be me, who doesn't know nearly as much as Todd. So it would not be the best respondent. But first of all, a shout out to some of the folks who are watching, some regulars and some new people. Dave is watching from Gurnee, Illinois, but also Dave is watching from the UK. So we have Daves all around the world enjoying this particular interview. So thank you, Daves. We're glad to see you. Robert is watching from Dayton, and Robert has a question. I'm going to get to it here in a minute. Michael Dorn is watching, and Michael simply has a comment. He says, I'm enjoying learning about this crucial election and its byproducts, including the Pendleton Act, civil service reforms. I think Dan touched on this a few minutes ago. This might be the introduction to a lot of people watching this to that long list of bearded Republicans that held the office in the late part of the 19th century. And until you actually start talking about the details, they may not seem as interesting as they really are. And so we're, fascinating opportunity to talk about the 1880 election. So first, I want to ask a question from Samuel Black in Dayton for Todd Arrington, and I think you've met before. Samuel sends out his greetings, Todd.
Okay, great.
And but Samuel wants to know, how important do you think Lucretia Garfield was to his success?
Oh, I think she was absolutely essential. I mean, just as we find out more about a lot of presidential spouses, a lot of first ladies, much later on, how critical they really were to their husbands' success.
Take a look at her.
Oh, sure. How critical they were to their husband's success, and really how shrewd and well-versed they were in the politics of the age. Now, obviously, at this point, for the most part, women and political wives didn't speak up as much as they do now. But I think that a lot of political spouses, a lot of first ladies were very important to their husbands, and were really. I mean, look at the John and Abigail Adams example. And Garfield at one point did say that Lucretia was his intellectual equal in every way. So he acknowledged her own intelligence. In fact, there's a great quote from his diary at one point where he says something about she's away, and he says something about he wishes she was here. He wants to talk to her because he wants her to bring him intelligence, and so I think that's a great acknowledgement of how he felt about her. So yeah, she was absolutely critical to his success for sure, and also to carrying on his legacy after he unfortunately died at just 49 years old.
Sure. Now I left this photograph from your book up there for a long time because we're not going to have a chance to introduce other women that are important to the book. But of course, there is his mother sitting next to them in the front porch campaign. And I am particularly interested, even though you're not really going to get a chance to talk about her, to Molly, who's standing back there dressed in a boy's suit with a boy's haircut. And I did notice that she was called the tomboy of the family and Dad's little girl. I don't really have a question about that, but
That's right.
certainly a really fascinating family. Hey, there might be a few more questions, and I'm going to continue to monitor the questions. So folks at home, if you have another one to ask, please do. And I might just jump in whenever in the next 30 minutes or so. But for now, I know Dan has a follow-up question to what you were talking about, and I want to let him jump back in and do that. Thank you very much, Todd.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about his relationship with Lincoln a bit, because you're saying here that Garfield was surprised that a second-rate Illinois lawyer could produce the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
And at the same time, there was an interest. So what were his views? Again, briefly, I have a lot to get into here on Lincoln.
Sure. Sorry. I know my answers tend to be a little more long-winded than they should
No, that's
be.
okay. That's all
love
right.
to talk
Let them
about
come and
Garfield,
read the
obviously.
book about all the rest of my questions.
There you go. There you go. Well, Garfield obviously was a loyal Republican. He was enthusiastic about Lincoln's candidacy in 1860. He, in fact, met Lincoln very briefly when Lincoln was on his way to Washington to become president. Garfield got frustrated because Garfield, being an abolitionist, even though, as I said before, he didn't really call himself that, Garfield felt like the war was clearly about slavery. Everybody knew it. And he believed, and he wrote a letter 2 days after the attack on Fort Sumter where he said, the war will soon assume the shape of slavery and freedom. So he was saying, right from the beginning, it's slavery is the root cause. We need to acknowledge that. And we also need to acknowledge that the Union is fighting not only to keep the Union together, but to abolish slavery. Obviously, Lincoln did not do that. Lincoln had an impeccable sense of timing. He knew when the time was right to say the Union is now fighting also to abolish slavery. So Garfield was frustrated with Lincoln for the first 2 years or so of the war, simply because Lincoln had not yet publicly said that. So by the time Lincoln does finally issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Garfield has something of a snarky comment about Lincoln being a second-rate Illinois lawyer.
Interesting. All right. But so something else, knowing, steeped in Garfield's character as you are, he said, you quote him about the Emancipation Proclamation, about freedmen, and that I could never get myself to fall in love with the creatures. Now, look, he was a 19th century man nonetheless. And it was a changing time, and he was probably changing within himself. People are compartmentalized to an extent as well, and have different feelings in different parts of themselves. I was surprised at your surprise that he said that. How do you react as a historian, a Garfield historian, to that phrase?
Well, I mean, obviously it's ugly for sure, but I'm obviously looking at it through 21st century eyes. You make a great point, Dan, that Garfield is a human being. He's not this marble bust up on a shelf. He was a human being, and he sometimes said things or did things that he wasn't proud of. And I think this is one of those moments where he refers to Black people as creatures. But then I think I think my sort of pivot there, at least in that section of the book, was, yeah, he said some things that maybe weren't what we would think of as appropriate today. But when it came time to vote on the floor of Congress on bills that would further political rights or ensure physical safety or continue to make America what it claimed to be for everyone, to truly guarantee that all men are created equal and have equal opportunity before the law, he was a reliable vote, a reliable yes vote. So we have to at least give him credit there.
Oh yeah, I give him a lot of credit because he followed through with that philosophy, even though he had inner thoughts. I hear love thy neighbor as thyself. I'm not sure that can be done. And I don't really care if people love me, just so they tolerate me. And I think that's what he was doing. He would not only tolerate, he wanted equality. I like that very much. And I think that's a great deal of credit to him. He's also, I've heard Garfield also um, uh, compared to John Kennedy. Young, personable, good orators, political, charismatic, war heroes. Do you like that comparison?
Well, I do for selfish reasons because as a very young teenager probably, one of my first kind of loves of history was John F. Kennedy, for exactly those reasons: young, good-looking, charismatic, personable, and as I got older and actually went to school and graduate school to become a historian. Yes, there are things about Kennedy we know now that are probably a little less appealing. That's the case for Garfield too, and I think for all of these presidents, because as I said, they're human beings, and I think the thing that makes them relatable to myself and to you and to everybody watching is the things that are maybe not their proudest moments. It reminds us that they were human. They were fallible. They were not perfect. So yeah, I like the comparison. I mean, I don't like the fact that they both got assassinated. Obviously, that's tragic.
Another comparison.
Yeah, and I do think that they were both great losses to the country. I think obviously when Kennedy died, and Lyndon Johnson took over, Johnson did, as we discussed earlier, sort of pick up the mantle and really move a lot of even Kennedy's ideas further than Kennedy had any intention to take them, with the Great Society and things like that. But yes, I think I do to a degree like that comparison. But I do think they were both, great losses to the country when they were, killed in their primes.
There was an interesting Lincoln connection at the beginning of the 1880 Republican Convention. The gavel used allegedly here in Chicago was a gavel made out of the wood from the frame of Lincoln's home. Now, this to me has Dennis Hanks' fingerprints all over it. Dennis was his mother's cousin, and he forged artifacts left and right afterward. That's all there is to it. And that probably is one of them. But loving artifacts, does that gavel exist anywhere today?
Oh boy, I have no idea.
Just
I don't
curious.
know. That's a great question. Another great Lincoln connection here, of course, is that Robert Lincoln, Abraham and Mary Lincoln's son, who people had been trying to get to run for some office for years, just because his name was Lincoln, did finally agree to serve in a presidential cabinet as Secretary of War for President James Garfield. So that's a great connection as well. And of course, Robert Lincoln is present about 40 feet away when Garfield is shot. And so, another tragic connection there to Lincoln as well.
And Garfield tried to get John Hay to be his secretary in the White House.
It's true. That's
Why
true.
did John Hay say no?
Well, John Hay, I think, probably felt like he'd already been to that rodeo.
Yeah.
And John Hay at that point, and this is 20 years after his time with Lincoln, was obviously 20 years older, and was married to a woman from Cleveland, Ohio, about 20 minutes down the road from where I'm sitting right now, and had a woman who was from a very wealthy family. So John Hay, I think, at that point maybe was kind of enjoying life without having a very stressful job like being a presidential private secretary. Hay, of course, as we know later, became the ambassador to the United Kingdom and then later Secretary of State as well.
I have so much to cover. We only have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to skip to a couple of things. I was going to go into the convention a great deal. Maybe we'll have a chance to do something there. But waving the bloody shirt was a big phrase for a long while. We didn't get into the Hancock and his background and how he was in the Democratic convention, why he was nominated. But were the Republicans unable to wave that bloody shirt? because Hancock was the Democratic nominee and a war hero? Was it successful at all, or did they just sublimate it?
Well, it was obviously very difficult. That was kind of an old standby for
Yeah.
Republicans, really from the Civil War on. That hey, if this election we don't think it's going well, we can always wave the bloody shirt, which is kind of this colloquialism for just reminding voters, not so subtly, that hey, Democrats are the party of secession, the party of slavery, the party that killed Abraham Lincoln, the party that tried to destroy the country, and the party that put roughly 300,000 United States soldiers in their graves. It is very hard to wave the bloody shirt at a guy like Winfield Scott Hancock in 1880, simply because he's still an active duty United States Army general, fought for the North in the Civil War, was wounded several times, including almost life-threateningly at Gettysburg. It's pretty hard to wave the bloody shirt at that guy. I mean, let's face it, Garfield has an impressive war record, which is almost a requirement to be a Republican president after the Civil War. But he's got nothing on Hancock when it comes to a military career. And so it was difficult so the Republicans had to proceed much more cautiously with that than they did in previous elections. They did still do it to some degree, but not nearly as much. And they really had, and I think I maybe mentioned this in there somewhere, that there was really this sort of big debate among the Republicans about how do we attack Hancock, because we can't wave the bloody shirt at a guy who literally bled and almost died for the Union.
Yeah. Now, this is really brief question here. The Greenback Party, it was just you state in the preface that it's a short chapter because it didn't have any real impact. If the Greenback Party had not been a third party, would those votes have gone more Democratic or Republican? Would it may have made a difference in that election if they had not had a party of their own?
Well, the Greenback Party, I think, and their candidate was James Weaver, who was a former Republican. So I'd like to think that those votes maybe would have gone more Republican. But there were the Greenback Party, of course, was named for their support of paper money, which Garfield himself was a hard money gold standard man. He didn't like greenbacks, didn't like paper money. Called greenbacks because of the green ink. These are introduced during the Civil War, and they really exist primarily on the good credit of the United States government. There's nothing really backing them up, or not as much, not gold. So the greenback, but there were hard money and soft money advocates in both parties. So it's hard to say if there had been no Greenback Party, would those votes have gone to Garfield? I think Weaver got about 300,000 popular votes, something like that. Or would they have gone to Hancock? And I think they probably would have been somewhat split. I'd like to think maybe they would have gone a little more Republican, just because Weaver was a Union veteran, was anti-slavery, was an abolitionist, and was a longtime Republican.
It was a nation divided, as you mentioned in this book, and it was a very close victory for Garfield. And of course, Reconstruction was changing in the South. Did Garfield face anything like Lincoln did in 1860, or maybe even Joe Biden does today?
Oh, well, I think soon to be President Biden has his work cut out for him, for sure. I mean, with the division we see now, and the violence and the insurrections and things like this that are happening. I think and clearly Lincoln himself said that he was going to Washington with a greater challenge than that, even that rested on George Washington. So I'm not sure I could quite say that Garfield was going into office with quite that much pressure on him. I think that would be maybe a little overstated. But certainly Garfield was still going into office with, as you say, a country very deeply divided. When you say he won a close election, I mean, he won. His popular vote victory was by something just around 10,000 votes out of millions of votes cast. Now, his electoral college victory was, very significant. But the popular vote margin was razor thin. So clearly the country's very divided. And clearly, you know, as I said, we have a solid South in this 1880 election. So the South is very heavily Democratic at this point. So Garfield, you know, knows it's going to be very close, and that's why he really focuses on swing states, what we would call today swing states like New York and Indiana, places like that. So yeah, while I don't think it's quite to the level that Lincoln faced with trying to keep the country from tearing itself apart in 1860 and 61. You know, there may be some parallels to what Biden is going to face here in just 6 days, when he's got to take over a country that is clearly very, very, very divided politically.
Before I turn this over to Bjorn, and actually Bjorn, I'll have one question maybe right after you to finish this up. I just want to say that it's a packed book. It's readable, but there's a lot there and things that we haven't gotten to, which I found fascinating. What was the unit rule that was so important in the 1880 election and the convention? What was that? How did Garfield get finally onto the 34th ballot, for heaven's sake? The Democratic convention was fascinating. I was wondering how he chose his cabinet. You get into that, and how Garfield put together that cabinet is a fascinating story. The elephant in the room is the assassination. Haven't talked about that one at all, but it's in the book, ends it in a way. We haven't talked why New York was flipped from Tilden to Garfield, and the 1860 whole campaign. So those are some of the things that you're going to read about in this. You might think a slim book at 220 pages, but there's a lot there to digest and enjoy. So, and you'll find a lot of things that are parallel to today as well. That, for instance, shutting down the government. Roscoe Conklin, who was he? Fascinating man in this book. And he thought it was revolutionary that one party might want to shut down the government if they couldn't get their way. Oh, we've seen that in the 1990s. We've seen that in this era as well. So
very much
Bjorn,
so.
why don't you get in here and then I'll ask my last question.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. And I had just shown that last photo that we were when we were talking there, and it was not a photo; it's the cover of Puck magazine, which you used to illustrate part of it, and it's Charlie Gitto, and it just occurred to me, and I don't want you to answer this question. It just occurred to me that the problem that really sent Charlie Gitto over the edge was civil service reform. There really was. He couldn't get the job he thought he was entitled to, and of course Garfield had a civil service reform platform where he's calling for professionals. Hey Todd, I want to let you know about a number of questions that we have out there. We might have time for you to answer some of them super quick, but I want to say a lot of them just so that we can greet our customers and recognize that they ask good questions. The first one, super quick, almost yes or no. Benjamin Norris wants to know if Garfield was ambidextrous. I have read that he could write with both hands at the same time in Latin and Greek. Yes or no?
No, the Latin and Greek thing is an old wives' tale, unfortunately. He was the first left-handed president, though.
Excellent. The first left-handed president. And then also Benjamin wanted to know in a larger sense, and if you could answer this question as concisely as you can, what was Garfield's relationship with Hayes?
They were friendly. There was a period when Garfield was in Congress, and while Hayes was president, that Garfield got a little frustrated with Hayes, and did express some of that. And I think I do cover that a little bit in the book. So mostly friendly. Garfield was a little frustrated for a while with Hayes as president, but they remained friendly.
Okay. Now, then we have a question from one of our Daves, and the clue to all of the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop regulars is it's Dave who's very interested in a statue, and sorry, it's Dave from the UK asking about a statue, not Dave from Gurney. Dave from the UK is taking over your your strength here. No, Dave from the UK wants to know, did Garfield have a connection with San Francisco? The reason I ask is because there is a statue of him in Golden Gate Park.
True, that statue is there. I'm not aware of any particular connection. A lot of cities, including Chicago, I believe, put statues up of Garfield after his assassination, just as a tribute to his memory.
Okay, and then I'll let Wayne Dirks give us the good closing question, because it's a good 10,000-foot question. Despite his short term, how would you define Garfield's legacy?
And I want to put mine with that, because it's the same question in a way, because you write that Hancock and Garfield mattered and still matter today. So both these questions can be combined, please.
Sure. And I will say to the last question, Garfield did make a trip to California. Whether or not he went to San Francisco, I don't know. I know he went to Yosemite at one point. But anyway, that's, maybe there's the connection.
Garfield's connection.
Well, there's definitely that. Yeah. As far as Garfield's legacy, I mean, there's any number of them. I do think that he represents certainly unrealized potential. I think he absolutely could have been an impactful president. I mentioned Heather Cox Richardson at the beginning. She did a great book on the history of the Republican Party several years ago. And she describes these kind of transformative figures that when the Republican Party has lost its way, does it probably sounds familiar, these transformative figures have kind of helped them course correct and come back to who they really were and why they were founded in the first place. Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower. I don't know if Lincoln would have been one of those transformative figures that she might have included had he lived. I think the potential was certainly there for him to be a strong president and to be someone who was very fondly remembered for leadership on civil rights, even when many members of his own party had already kind of started moving on from that issue. I think civil service reform obviously plays a huge role in his legacy as well, because of Arthur then signing the Pendleton Act, really is kind of a tribute to Garfield's memory. So I think those are probably his two primary legacies that people are aware of. But the whole point of the book, in addition to talking about the election, is just to try to convince people that, hey, Garfield there's a lot more to him than just an accidental president who was assassinated.
Well, I want to thank you, Todd, for being with us before Bjorn takes us off. This is an enjoyable book to read, especially in this time. It was just so much going back and forth, and I felt they are us and we are they. And I think many people will enjoy this book and the 1880 election quite a bit. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Bjorn.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. And I want to very quickly tell the folks that are still watching, the folks that are watching this on YouTube later, about the book they've been hearing about and 3 upcoming events that I think you'll really like. But first of all, the book that we're talking about today, Benjamin Todd Arrington has given us The Last Lincoln Republican, the presidential election of 1880. It is available from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and we will ship it to you. There is a link in the comments of this video. You can click right through there. You can order the book, and we will send you a signed copy of The Last Lincoln Republican, signed on a custom book plate by the author, Todd Arrington. And we will see you next time on A House Divided.